Elliot Marsh made his wife wash his girlfriend's dishes while she watched. That is where the story begins. Not with shouting, not with a slammed door, not with any of the dramatic gestures that might have made what happened next feel earned or expected. It begins in a kitchen in the Fairview district of Boston on a Tuesday evening in November, with a pregnant woman standing at a sink in her winter coat while the smell of another woman's cooking settled into the walls around her. And the sound of dinner conversation continuing uninterrupted in the next room, as though she were not there at all. Simone Lorette was in that next room. So was Frances Marsh, Elliot's mother, who had looked at May's 8-month stomach from her chair and said to no one and everyone, "I told him she'd make a scene." Elliot was there too, standing in the kitchen doorway, just long enough to gesture at the sink before turning back to his guests. The bouillabaisse pot, the serving bowls, the wine glasses with their dark rings. Someone needed to deal with those. May dealt with them. What none of them knew, what Elliot Marsh had never once thought to find out in 6 years of marriage, was that the building they were standing in belonged to his wife. Not just the townhouse, the entire Aldercroft portfolio. $55.7 billion in administered, under a name that had been on the front of that building the entire time he had lived, in just a story about a woman who was humiliated in her own home. It's about what happens when the people who mistake silence for weakness finally meet the water that has been running underneath. If this story is already making you feel something, hit that like button and subscribe. May's story deserves every witness it can get. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight, because, snorts, to understand what that kitchen actually meant, we need to go back to where this really began. To understand what happened that night, we need to go back to where this really began. The Aldercroft townhouse had stood on Whitmore Crescent in the Fairview district for 112 years. 4 stories of federal-style brownstone, black iron railings along the front steps, the name Aldercroft pressed in brass beside the door so long that the letters had worn smooth at their edges. Generations of people had walked past that name without reading it. Elliot Marsh had walked past it every day for 6 years. He had never once wondered whose name it was. May set her cardboard box down on the hallway floor and looked at the kitchen. She took it in the way she had trained herself to take in difficult things. Completely, quietly, without letting her face do anything that could be used against her. Simone's bouillabaisse pot on the stove still fragrant, the handwritten recipe card propped against the backsplash, and Simone's looping script like a flag planted in occupied territory. 3 wine glasses on the dining table, one still half full, a candle burned to its last half-inch. Wax pooled around the base, Simone's reading glasses on the counter beside the recipe card folded with the casual confidence of someone who expects to need them again in the morning. The archaeology of a woman who had decided she lived here. Frances Marsh sat at the head of the dining table in a cream blouse, her silver hair set with the precision of someone who had once believed appearance was the primary argument and had never revised the position. She looked at May's stomach, round and low under her winter coat, 8 months of life pressing forward, and said to the room, to Simone, to the general air of the evening, "I told him she'd make a scene." Elliot was in the kitchen doorway. He did not quite look at May when he spoke. "The cleaning service comes tomorrow morning," he said in the tone of a man relaying practical information. "Someone needs to deal with those tonight." A gesture toward the sink, the pot, the bowls nested inside each other, the dark wine ring glasses. May looked at him for one moment. He had already turned away. She walked to the sink. She turned on the hot water. Simone appeared in the doorway then, arms folded, wine glass in hand, watching with the relaxed attention of someone observing something that did not concern her. "The pot needs to soak first," she said lightly, pleasantly even. "The bottom scorches if you don't." And then she turned back to the dining room, sat down and laughed at something Frances said, and did not look at May again. Here is what the narrator needs to say plainly, because none of the people in that room were going to say it. The Aldercroft townhouse, all 4 floors of it, the worn brass letters beside the door, the deed filed under Suffolk County Record Number 2019 ATM 044, belongs to May, not to Elliot, not to the marriage, to May Aldercroft Marsh, sole named trustee of Aldercroft Trust Management, whose $55.7 billion portfolio encompasses 22 residential and commercial properties across Greater Boston, a private infrastructure bond fund with positions in 6 New England states, and a 34% controlling interest in Marsh & Vance Commercial Group, the firm that carries Elliot's family name, that his uncle Robert built from a single commercial lease in 1987, and that has depended for 4 consecutive years on a capital account designated ATC7 in its internal ledger. No one at Marsh & Vance had ever traced that account to its named trustee. No one had looked. Simone Lorette had been cooking dinner and leaving her reading glasses on the counter and telling the building's owner how to wash a pot. She had been doing this in May's kitchen, with May's wine glasses, in a home that would never, in any legal sense that was shortly going to matter, belong to the man who had invited her into it. May soaked the pot. She washed the serving bowls. She cleaned each wine glass with the methodical care of someone who had been taught that how you handle things when no one is watching is the only true measure of character. The water ran hot. She did not rush. She did not let her hands shake, though they wanted to. She set the last glass on the drying rack with a small, precise click. Then she picked up her cardboard box from the hallway floor and walked out into the November rain. She drove without destination for 20 minutes before she found herself pulling into a parking lot off Route 9, the engine running, the rain loud on the roof. She put one hand on her stomach. With the other, she found the recording on her phone, her mother's voice, thin but unmistakably steady, from 18 months ago. Still water runs deep, May. Let the surface stay calm. Everything that matters happens underneath. She listened to it twice. Then she found Josephine Carr in her contacts, pressed call, and waited. Josephine answered on the second ring. "It's May," she said. A pause, then Josephine's voice, even and precise as always. "I know. What do you need?" May looked through the rain-streaked windshield at the parking lot, lights blurring orange in the wet. She thought about the pot soaking in the sink. She thought about Simone's back already turned, already certain. She thought about the weight of her daughter pressing forward against her coat. "Everything," May said. "I need everything ready." It was the first act of choice she had made in 2 years. It felt surprisingly like stillness. Josephine had asked one question before she said goodnight. How far back does the trust go? And that question, practical, procedural, the kind Josephine asked the way other people breathe, snorts this story back to where it actually began. Not to a kitchen in November, to a warehouse in South Boston 43 years ago, and a woman who understood something about power that most people spend their entire lives failing to learn. Gloria Aldercroft had inherited the warehouse at 31 from her own mother, who had acquired it in a tax settlement and considered it a consolation prize. Gloria considered it a beginning. The building sat on Dorchester Avenue near the old rail yards, squat, unglamorous, the kind of structure that serious people drove past without slowing down. Gloria did not find it unglamorous. She found it useful. She leased it to a cold storage company for 3 years, used the income to acquire a small commercial property in Quincy, leased that, waited, acquired again. She did this quietly and continuously for 4 decades, compounding both her assets and her anonymity with equal deliberateness. She never hired a publicist. She never attended a gala. She drove the same dark green Volvo from 1991 until 2002, and when people commented on it, she said only that it ran fine. May grew up watching her mother practice invisibility the way other children watch their parents practice ambition. Gloria never explained the portfolio in numbers. She explained it in behavior. She explained it on Saturday mornings when they drove to the farmer's market in the Volvo, and Gloria pointed at buildings. That one is leased to a printing company. That one to a dentist's office. That corner property to a restaurant that will fail within 18 months. Watch. And May learned to read a street the way her mother read it, not for what was visible, but for what was underneath. The philosophy arrived in pieces before it arrived in words. Still water runs deep. Let the surface stay calm. Everything that matters happens underneath. Gloria said it for the first time when May was 14 and had come home from school humiliated by something a girl named Christine Baxter had said in front of the entire cafeteria. May had been crying. Gloria had not rushed to comfort her. She had handed her a glass of water and sat down across from her at the kitchen table and said it plainly, the way she said everything. Still water runs deep, May. Let the surface stay calm. Everything that matters happens underneath. Then she had explained without sentimentality that Christine Baxter would peak at 17 and that May would remember this conversation when she was 34, and Christine would not remember May's name at all. Gloria had been right about Christine. She had been right about most things. The legal architecture came later, built by Josephine Carr over the course of a 15-year professional relationship that May had inherited along with everything else. The Aldercroft Family Trust had been formalized in 2009, structured to hold all portfolio assets as separate property, insulated from any future marital claim by a governing agreement so precisely drafted that Josephine had once described it to a colleague as the document she was most proud of in 30 years of practice. When May met Elliot Marsh at a mutual friend's dinner in 2017 and their relationship progressed toward marriage, Josephine prepared a prenuptial agreement. Elliot signed it without significant review. He had seen the Aldercroft name in the document heading and registered it the way he registered old Boston family names generally. As pleasant background detail, the suggestion of a modest inheritance, nothing requiring investigation. He did not investigate. This is important. May did not conceal. She simply did not announce. There is a difference, and the distinction mattered to her and still does. The early marriage was genuinely warm. That also matters because it would be easier if it weren't. Elliot, in those first 2 years, was attentive in the specific way of a man who has decided he has chosen well and wants to demonstrate the quality of his judgment. He brought her coffee before she asked. He learned the names of her mother's buildings and asked about them with what seemed like real interest. At their first Thanksgiving as a married couple, Frances had been present and already subtly pointed in her observations. She had looked at May's soft figure in its holiday dress and said with a smile arranged to indicate warmth that May was so comfortable in herself. It's really quite refreshing. But even Frances had been contained, still performing the role of a woman willing to be won over. May had noticed Frances's particular brand of compliment from the first dinner she attended. She had filed it quietly and said nothing. What she also said nothing about, to Elliot, to Frances, to anyone, was the ATC7 account. The Marsh & Vance Capital Ledger had carried the Aldercroft Trust Management account since 2016, 1 year before May and Elliot met. Established through a referral from Josephine's firm to Robert Vance directly. It was the firm's single largest external investor. Its contributions had underwritten 3 significant Marsh & Vance acquisitions in 4 years. Elliot had reviewed the ledger countless times. He had seen ATC7 on every quarterly summary. He had never asked what it stood for. He had never traced it to its named trustee. The irony does not announce itself. It never did. It simply sat there in plain numbers, waiting. The warmth between May and Elliot began cooling so gradually that she could not later identify the precise moment it became cold. What she could identify were the incidents. The first one that registered came 3 months into her pregnancy when Elliot looked at her across the breakfast table, her stomach not yet showing, just the soft fullness of early months, and said she might want to watch the pasta. Not harshly, conversationally. The way a man says something he has already decided is helpful. She had not said anything. She had looked at him for a moment, then looked back at her plate. That look, the quiet taking in, the careful filing, had become over the following months the primary vocabulary of their marriage. Gloria's illness arrived in the first trimester and moved quickly. By the time May was showing, Gloria had lost most of her voice. They communicated in writing, in gestures, in the particular shorthand of 2 people who had never needed many words. May drove to Commonwealth Avenue every Sunday morning and sat across from her mother at the uncluttered desk, and they read the week's property reports together in comfortable silence. The 1987 photograph watched from its place on the desk. The South Boston warehouse behind Gloria's younger face, that rare, real smile. 6 weeks before the end, Gloria had a single clear morning, the kind that comes unpredictably in those final months. A window that opens and closes, and she had used it to take May's hand across the desk and say it one more time. Still water runs deep, May. Let the surface stay calm. Everything that matters happens underneath. May had pressed record on her phone before her mother finished the first word. She had not told her she was doing it. She had simply known with the quiet certainty that had been building in her since that Saturday morning in the Volvo that she was going to need to hear it again, more than once, in the dark, alone. She was right about that, too. The Sunday morning was quiet in the way that only large buildings are quiet on weekends. A deep structural silence, the kind that comes from hundreds of empty offices and stopped elevators in a city that has, for a few hours, agreed to slow down. May took the elevator to the 14th floor alone. Her weight shifted back the way it had been for weeks now, her hand resting on her stomach, out of habit rather than thought. The baby moved once as the elevator rose, a slow roll that May had come to recognize as a greeting. She pressed her palm flat and said nothing. Gloria's office looked exactly as it always had, the uncluttered desk, the single-frame photograph, the two chairs positioned across from each other with the particular formality of a room that had conducted serious business and expected to continue doing so. May had changed very little since taking over the space. She had added a second desk lamp, a small filing cabinet to the left of the window, a stack of current property reports that she reviewed on Sunday mornings, the way Gloria had reviewed them before her. The 1987 photograph remained where it had always been, behind the desk, slightly to the left. Gloria in her canvas jacket, the warehouse, that rare, unguarded smile. May sat down in her mother's chair. She had not come with an agenda. She had driven 40 minutes from the apartment she was temporarily renting in Cambridge through Sunday morning streets that were wet from the previous night's rain, and she had not known precisely why she was coming until she arrived. But she knew now. She had known when the elevator opened. She had known when she sat down and felt the chair receive her the way it always did, with the particular solidity of something built to last. She looked at the photograph for a long time. The woman in that photograph had stood in front of a building on Dorchester Avenue that nobody wanted and had understood something about it that nobody else could see. She had been 31 years old. She had been alone. She had not announced her intentions to anyone because she had already learned by 31 that announcing intentions invites interference, and interference slows everything down. She had simply begun, quietly, continuously, one property at a time, one lease at a time, one reinvestment at a time, for 40 years, until what she had built was so large and so thoroughly documented that it required a 17-page legal summary to describe it accurately. And she had done all of it while the surface stayed calm. May understood now what her mother had meant by it, not just as philosophy, not just as temperament, as a specific operational instruction. The surface is what people watch. The surface is what they judge, dismiss, underestimate, and fail to investigate. The surface is where Elliot had looked when he looked at his wife, at her soft figure and her quiet manner, and her apparent lack of professional ambition, and decided there was nothing underneath that required his attention. The surface is where Frances had looked when she told her book club about the lost little girl. The surface is where Simone had looked when she turned her back at the sink, already certain. They had all looked at the surface. Not one of them had looked underneath. May's hands were folded over her stomach, still, completely still, and something settled in her chest that she recognized after a moment as the particular weight of a decision that has already been made. Not the anxiety of deciding, but the quiet gravity of having decided. She was not going to protect herself. She was not going to correct any record or settle any score. She was going to stop allowing her silence to function as permission. She was going to do it for the daughter pressing against her ribcage, who was going to come into this world in a matter of days, and who was going to need to know, at some point in her life, what her mother had done when things became very hard, what she had chosen, how she had chosen it. May picked up her phone. She found Josephine in her contacts. She pressed call. Josephine answered on the second ring as she always did. "Carr, it's May. I'd like to move forward." A pause, brief. Then, "I've been waiting for this call." "I know." May looked at the photograph. "I needed to be sure." "Are you sure now?" May thought about a parking lot off Route 9 and a pot soaking in her own sink and a woman's back already turned before the sentence was finished. "Yes. Then I need 10 days, possibly 12. "That's fine." It won't be contentious if you don't want it to be, Josephine said. The documentation is sufficient. We don't need to argue anything. We simply need to present it. That's all I want, May said. Just the presentation. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, May set the phone on the desk and sat for a while longer in the quiet of the 14th floor, looking at her mother's face in the photograph, that rare smile, the warehouse, the canvas jacket, and felt for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate that the floor beneath her feet was solid. Not shifting, not contingent, solid. The documentation would take 10 days. The baby came in 7. May's labor began on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks before her due date, in the Cambridge apartment, alone. She drove herself to Boston General with a particular focused calm of someone who has recently made a very large decision and found that smaller emergencies no longer have the same power to unsettle her. The nurse who admitted her, a woman named Angela Morris who had been working labor and delivery for 19 years, later told a colleague that she had never seen a woman arrive to deliver a baby looking quite so composed. The delivery was 6 hours, hard, necessary hours. Another nurse, Patricia Okafor, held May's hand through the last of it without being asked and did not say anything unnecessary. And May was grateful for both the hand and the silence in equal measure. When it was over and the room had softened into something quieter, and the weight in May's arms was warm and breathing and unmistakably real, the attending physician asked what name she had chosen. May looked down at her daughter's face, round, solemn, blinking at the light with the grave concentration of someone encountering the world for the first time and finding it complex but manageable. Gloria, May said without hesitation. Elliot sent flowers the following morning, 24 white roses, a card with his handwriting on it that May read once and set aside. She thanked him by text, 2 words. Then she turned back to her daughter's face, where everything that mattered was already present, already visible, already enough. 6 weeks later, the documentation was complete. The meeting was called and May Aldercroft Marsh, sole trustee of a $55.7 billion estate, dressed in a charcoal blazer and settled her daughter into a carrier against her chest and drove to Marsh & Vance. The Marsh & Vance Partners meeting room was on the 9th floor of a building on Congress Street that Elliot had always considered one of the firm's better addresses. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a long mahogany table that seated 12, the kind of room designed to communicate that the people inside it were serious and that what happened inside it mattered. Elliot arrived at 8:50, 10 minutes early, in a charcoal suit and the particular expression of a man who has been told this is routine and has chosen to believe it. Gerald Holt arrived 2 minutes later. They took seats on the same side of the table near the middle and waited. May arrived at 9:01 exactly. She came through the door with Josephine Carr beside her and a leather document portfolio under Josephine's arm, and Gloria in a soft carrier against May's chest, 6 weeks old, asleep with the absolute confidence of someone who has not yet learned that the world requires vigilance. May wore a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse, her dark hair pulled back simply, her posture straight in the careful way of a woman whose body is still remembering what it just did and has chosen not to make an announcement about it. The building manager, a man named David Chen, who had coordinated the meeting logistics, introduced her to the room as the authorized representative and sole name trustee of Aldercroft Trust Management. The room processed this introduction in the way that rooms process information that doesn't yet have a category. 3 junior partners exchanged a glance. Robert Vance, seated at the head of the table, looked up from the agenda page in front of him. Gerald Holt clicked his pen once and stopped. Elliot looked up 7 seconds after everyone else. He saw his wife. He saw his daughter asleep against her chest. He saw Josephine Carr, whom he recognized from one meeting 3 years ago, in a context he could not immediately place. Something moved across his face, not recognition of the full situation, not yet, but the first registered wrongness of it. The sense that the geometry of the room had shifted in a way he had not prepared for. May did not look at him. She sat down at the far end of the table, settled the carrier with one hand and nodded to Josephine. Josephine opened the portfolio. The first document she placed in the center of the table was the ATC7 account summary, 4 pages, tabbed, the Aldercroft Trust Management letterhead visible across the top. 4 years of capital contributions to Marsh & Vance totaling $227 million. Itemized by quarter, each line dated and signed. She placed it without commentary and without looking at anyone in particular. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something important has arrived and no one has yet decided what to do about it. The second document was the accounts governing agreement, the legal instrument that established the terms of the ATC-7 investment, including on page 4, the clause requiring full trustee authorization for any withdrawal exceeding $50,000. Josephine placed it directly beneath the first. The third document was a single page, the $340,000 capital call withdrawal. Elliot Marsh, named partner. Execution date, March 14th of the prior year. Trustee authorization, absent. Josephine set it down with the same flat efficiency as the others. Robert Vance had been reading. He had not looked up from the account summary since Josephine placed it. Now he turned to the governing agreement, found page 4, read the authorization clause. His jaw tightened once, then released. He turned to the withdrawal record and held it for a long moment, the paper perfectly still in his hands, and said nothing. The fourth document was the Aldercroft Trust Management Organizational Chart. 1 page, clean, simple, the kind of document a careful administrator produces because clarity is its own form of authority. At the top, in a box in plain type, sole trustee, May Aldercroft Marsh. Robert Vance read it, then he read it again. Then he set it on the table with a precision that suggested he was using the act of placing it down to give himself a moment to decide what expression he intended to wear for the rest of the meeting. He looked across the table at Elliot. The expression he settled on was not anger. It was something quieter and more permanent than anger. It was the face of a man watching the architecture of something he built reveal a flaw he did not put there. He said, "How long has Aldercroft been in this position?" The room held its breath. May looked at Robert Vance, not at Elliot, not at Gerald Holt, not at the junior partners who had stopped pretending to consult their papers, at Robert Vance directly, steadily, with the composure of still water and the weight of 4 years of patience behind it. "Since the beginning," she said. "I assumed Elliot had mentioned it." The fifth document landed into the silence that followed, the 34% controlling interest documentation confirming that Marsh & Vance's continued operation under its current partnership structure required the ongoing participation of the ATC-7 account and the ongoing consent of its trustee. Josephine placed it without commentary, as she had placed all the others, because the documents did not require her voice. Elliot had not moved. He sat very still in the particular way of a man who has run the available calculations and found that none of them produce a favorable outcome. Gerald Holt leaned toward him and said something low and brief into his ear. Elliot did not respond. He was looking at the organizational chart, at his wife's name, at the word soul, at the word trustee, at the fact that this piece of paper had existed with those words on it for the duration of their entire marriage, and he had never seen it because he had never thought to look. Josephine then placed the second package in front of Robert Vance, not in the center of the table, directly before him, deliberately as a communication about audience. The personal financial misconduct record, the $340,000, 3 additional transfers from the joint household account, $41,000, $22,000, $28,000, routed to a personal account in Elliot's name alone over 14 months. The documented timeline of May's removal from financial access, assembled from bank records and written communications, into a chronology so precise and thorough that it had clearly been built by someone who had been building it for considerably longer than 6 weeks. Robert Vance turned the pages. He did not look up. Josephine placed the final document, the Aldercroft Residential Property Registry, 22 properties, Boston and surrounding areas in the general center of the table without remark. She did not draw attention to page 3 where Unit 4B on Beacon Hill appeared, currently occupied by Francis Marsh, lease administered by Aldercroft Trust Management, renewable at trustee discretion. She simply left it in the stack face up, legible to anyone at the table who chose to read it. Then she folded her hands in front of her and was silent, because the work was done and nothing further was required. Robert Vance closed the financial misconduct package. He set it squarely in front of him and put both hands flat on the table in the way of a man calling a room to a different kind of attention. He looked at Elliot for a long moment. Elliot did not meet his eyes. "I'll need Gerald to stay," Robert Vance said quietly. "Everyone else." The junior partners gathered their things and left with the careful speed of people who understand they have witnessed something significant and want to be well clear of it. The door closed. May Rose settled Gloria higher against her chest and picked up her own copy of the portfolio. She glanced at Elliot once, briefly, with an expression that held no triumph and no cruelty and no invitation to continue. Just a clear, final look. The look of a woman who has said everything she needed to say without raising her voice. Then she walked out. Behind her, she heard Robert Vance begin to speak to his nephew. She did not slow her pace. She did not turn around. She pressed the elevator button and waited, one hand resting on Gloria's sleeping back, feeling the small rise and fall of her daughter's breathing against her palm, steady and certain as anything she had ever known. The elevator came. The doors closed. The 9th floor fell away beneath her. The institutional collapse had already begun. Everything that followed would simply be paperwork. What followed was not dramatic. That is worth saying plainly because the stories we tell about consequences tend to reach for fire and noise, for slammed doors and shouted reckonings. What actually happened in the weeks after the Marsh and Vance partners meeting was quieter than that and more complete. Robert Vance convened the emergency partnership session on a Thursday. The restructuring terms were agreed upon in 2 hours. Elliot retained 40% of his prior equity position and was removed from capital call authority with immediate effect. Gerald Holt negotiated with the focused efficiency of a man who has assessed the available leverage and found none, and who understands that prolonging such a process only generates additional documentation of damage. Elliot signed. He did not contest the terms. He had nothing left to contest them with. The divorce proceedings moved through Josephine's hands like water through a clean channel. May did not want Elliot's money. She wanted 3 things: the custody arrangement she had specified, the signed acknowledgement of financial misconduct, and the quiet. Josephine got all 3 in 6 weeks. The settlement was filed on a Tuesday morning. May did not attend. She had already moved on to the next item in the stack. Simone Lorette was out of the Aldercroft townhouse within 30 days of Josephine's letter. She left without contacting May. There was nothing, after all, that she could have said that would have helped her situation, and without contacting Elliot either, once she understood the full dimensions of what his position now represented. The Boston social world that she had believed she was stepping into had been built on a name, and the name had been built on a foundation she could no longer access. She was practical enough to understand this quickly. She did not linger. Frances Marsh renewed her Beacon Hill lease in the 3rd week of March. The terms were standard. The letter from Aldercroft Trust Management arrived, as Josephine had said it would, through standard channels. No personal note, no additional communication, just the renewal paperwork with the Aldercroft letterhead and a signature line at the bottom. Frances signed it. She did not call May. May did not expect her to and did not require it. The paperwork was filed. The matter was closed. Elliot called once. It was a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after the settlement, and May was sitting in Gloria's office when the phone rang. She looked at his name on the screen for a long moment. Then she answered. He said he wanted to understand. He said he had not known. He said, and this was the truest thing he said, the one that carried the specific weight of genuine recognition, that he had not looked, that he had never looked. May listened to this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "I know." And then she said goodbye and ended the call and set the phone face down on the desk and sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a woman who has closed the last open door. She did not explain further. She did not need to. Then the scene softened into something quieter. And this is where May's story actually ends. It is a Thursday evening in early March, and the light through the Commonwealth Avenue windows has just begun to change. Not warm yet, not spring, but no longer the flat gray of February either. Something in it suggests that the season is considering its options. Gloria is asleep in the bassinet beside the desk, 7 weeks old, her small face round and solemn, and absolutely perfect in the way of new things that have not yet been diminished by anything. Her breathing is the steadiest sound in the room. The 1987 photograph is on the desk where it has always been. Gloria in her canvas jacket, the South Boston warehouse behind her. That rare, unguarded smile, the one she gave to buildings, apparently, and to her daughter and to no one else in particular. May does not move the photograph to storage. She does not replace it with her own. She leaves it exactly where her mother placed it because some arrangements are correct and do not need to be improved upon, and because the woman in that photograph built everything underneath May's feet and asked for nothing visible in return. And that kind of love does not get filed away or set aside or archived. It stays right where it is, where you can see it from the chair. May picks up her phone. She finds the recording. She presses play for the first time in weeks because she has not needed to hear it recently. It has simply been running as it always does underneath. Her mother's voice thin and steady and unmistakably present. Still water runs deep, May. Let the surface stay calm. Everything that matters happens underneath. She listens to it once. Then she sets the phone on the desk and puts one hand on the edge of the bassinet and looks at her daughter's face and breathes. This is what May Aldercroft Marsh's story is really about. Not the documents, not the meeting, not the moment Elliot Marsh finally understood what he had never bothered to investigate. Those things mattered and they happened, and they were right. But the story is about this. That quiet strength is not the absence of power, but its fullest expression. That the woman the room looks through is often the one holding the room together, and that the water which carves the canyon does not announce itself. It does not celebrate. It does not stop to see what it has made. It simply continues as it always has, as it always will. Still water, the narrator says one final time, runs deep. Before we go, if May's story moved you the way it moves so many others who have sat with it, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Was there a moment that hit differently for you? A scene you needed to hear? And as always, drop where you're watching from. This community stretches further than you know, and every location in the comments is someone who understood exactly what the story was about. The light through the Commonwealth Avenue windows is the same light that falls on the South Boston warehouse on Dorchester Avenue, where a woman in a canvas jacket stood in 1987 and saw something no one else could see. May knows this now. She has always known it in the way that children absorb the truest things their parents know before either of them can name what is being passed between them. She leaves the photograph exactly where it is. She stays in the chair. Outside, Boston is considering spring. That is enough. That has always been enough.